scientists, engineers, doctors, public health specialists, science communicators, journalists, and students, of course, from all over India and from, in fact, students from around the world, researchers from around the world. As part of the activities of this group, we have produced a lot of original material on science popularization about COVID, about busting hoaxes, and other resources for the public. These are available on our webpage. Please, I encourage all of you who haven't been with us before to go and check this out. And we also have some work with which is targeted towards scientists and public health experts, which is on modeling and data analysis on COVID-19. And more recently, we have some work which is for specifically for teachers and students, and all this can be found on our webpage. We have an active group on Facebook, and there is a YouTube channel with a lot of videos which talks about this material, as well as this particular video, which will be which is being currently live streamed on Facebook, as well as will be available on YouTube. It is also being streamed on YouTube, I think. So if for the questions, so the idea will be that Yogesh will talk for 30 minutes, Yogesh, and then we will have about the same amount of time of question answers. For those on Facebook, please type in your questions. Somebody will transmit it, and we will ask the speaker these questions. Yogesh, very happy to have you.
Thanks a lot, Akshay, and thanks to ISRC for inviting us to give this talk about GoCoronaGo. So this is work that's done by Tarun and myself. Tarun is another faculty at IISc, along with our sort of brave souls who are our students and staff who've been sort of working with us over the past 3-4 months on this project. So this talk today is going to be on GoCoronaGo, which is the name of our contact tracing app, which we've developed at IISc, and it's currently under deployment at IISc. So I'll share some of our experiences with sort of developing and deploying this app, and also broadly in terms of use of digital technologies for contact tracing. So one of the key reasons why we started off this project was keeping in mind the health and safety of our campus community, right? So which is predominantly based of students and residential faculty. As time has gone along, that seems to be the new normal, in that we are going to have to live with this virus for the foreseeable future, maybe months or potentially even years together. So the question is, in the midst of all of this, how do we ensure that the campus can be a safe and healthy environment, while at the same time we are able to go around with limited restrictions and still be productive when it comes to our education, teaching, and research, and so on. And to this end, can we be proactive in managing COVID rather than just reactive? Rather than chasing the virus, can we actually chase it away? And also, can we sort of learn from global best practices so that we can adopt it within IISc and try to sort of keep our campus community safe? But obviously, the usefulness of this work can go beyond the IISc campus as well down the line. But we see the campus as a mini laboratory in a sense, where we can try out some of these things, right? As all of you know by now, there are sort of 4 major pillars to managing COVID. So the most obvious one that all of us practice on a daily basis is all the preventive measures like wearing masks, social distancing, washing our hands, and so on. And that's probably the best thing that you can do to manage COVID. But then again come the next layers, which are more in terms of controlling it once it starts spreading. One of which is contact tracing, which we'll get to right now. And contact tracing broadly means that you want to identify people who are tested COVID positive and try to identify who are the other contacts who came in proximity to this COVID positive patient, and try to sort of quarantine them so that they don't spread it further. And obviously testing, whether it's targeted testing of people who are primary contacts or sort of people who are symptomatic, or more broad-based population testing to identify the spread of the virus within the community. So these are all sort of various strategies that you can put to play, right? Specifically getting into contact tracing, the standard way of doing contact tracing, which has been done sort of for previous epidemics as well, is this notion of a manual contact tracing, meaning that once someone is tested COVID positive, the sort of healthcare workers talk to them, try to sort of identify who else they've been in contact with in the last week or so, and where they met them and so on, so that they have sort of history of the people who might have come into contact with this patient since the time that they actually contracted the virus, which might be several days before they are actually tested positive, and then to actually reach out to these individuals so that they can be sort of quarantined or tested further. However, manual contact tracing has several challenges. One of it is obviously people might not remember everyone that they were interacting with, and also people might not know whom they talked to in case they are in some public space, so like sitting in a bus or something like that, where they were co-local with someone else whom they don't know, who are third parties. That's another challenge. And there is also the challenge that it takes a while for you to even reach out to these people. It might be in the order of several hours or several days by the time you are able to trace and track these primary contacts and sort of try to contain that. And each hour or so lost in contact tracing is an hour that that particular individual might be spreading, a primary contact might be spreading the virus. So digital contact tracing has been used even in sort of other contexts before COVID-19, 19 in the context of even epidemics among, for example, animals and so on, as part of the foot and mouth disease and such. But it's really sort of come to play proactively as part of COVID-19. And Singapore and Korea are two examples where they have sort of deployed this at large scales, and potentially China as well, though we don't have a lot of information from over there. And this has a role to play. It's not a replacement for manual contact tracing, but it's an additional tool that you have in your repository to try and make the contact tracing more effective. And the idea is fairly simple. The assumption is that many of us have these smartphones on us in our physical person. And when you have an app, a contact tracing app running on your phone, it's just going to use the Bluetooth technology present in your phone to advertise a unique identifier for your smartphone, right? You can think of this a little bit like the hotspots that you might identify when you have your phone working as a hotspot. But the key difference is that you just advertise it and others pick up the fact that this device ID is being broadcast. You don't actually make a connection itself, right? So it's almost like making a note of all the device IDs that are being broadcast around you in your immediate vicinity. And typically the range of Bluetooth low energy is about 15 feet or so, which is very well in keeping with the range of propagation for your typical COVID situation. So effectively, your app is going to work like a bit of a journal or a diary that writes down the time and the list of device IDs that are in its neighborhoods. And this happens periodically, let's say every 1 minute or so. The device looks around, sees what device IDs are being broadcast, makes a note of that, and so then goes back. And all the time, it's still continuing to transmit its own device ID to others, right? And this is how predominantly most of the contact tracing apps around the world work on, those that are based on Bluetooth. And that's what, in a sense, even Arogya Setu and Singapore Trace Together and so on do as well. Just to give you a visualization of this, if you get all these users who are running the contact tracing app, they make a note of it. These sort of purple bins are where the data is stored, and the data is stored locally on that particular phone. And this again is done with the intent of privacy, in the sense that the data that you collect about your contacts, the random IDs that you collect in your proximity, are kept locally on your phone. And when there is a COVID positive subject who's identified, at that point in time, the app in the backend, so someone sort of says that, hey, so-and-so device ID user is tested positive. At that point in time, you actually go and fetch that particular individual's contact data. In this case, for example, if N is the one who was tested positive, then you would actually go to the local database of N sitting on the phone and get their list of contacts in the last so many days. And then you would actually reach out to those owners of those device IDs, maybe through the app or through some phone, in case they've registered their phone as part of the app, and then say that, hey, you're a potential primary contact. Why don't you go get tested, or why don't you start quarantining yourself, and so on. So you start doing this. And likewise, let's say F is tested positive, then the neighborhood of F is alerted based on their local data that they store, and then sort of contact tracing happens. And this is useful, but there are a couple of challenges with this and limitations of this. So one is that you can only do primary contacts, meaning that you get to know the immediate neighborhood of the one who was COVID positive, but getting hold of the secondary and tertiary contacts, it's much more challenging, right? The second aspect is that this is reactive in the sense that after someone is tested COVID positive, you then reach out to their neighbors and so on and try to do contact tracing. It doesn't sort of do a lot from a proactive means, right? And these were sort of a couple of the reasons why we in GoCoronaGo take a slightly different approach, right? In GoCoronaGo or GCG as we call it, we actually do centralized contact tracing, which means that you still collect the data just using Bluetooth. However, you actually send this data to a centralized server and you stitch all the data together almost on a periodic basis, every 15 minutes or so. You actually have a sort of view of how the contact interactions are within that particular set of users. But the key thing over here is that this is designed for institutional use, right? So which means that the data itself is collected only for a particular institution and its members, and the data is retained within that particular institution. It's not designed to be a city-wide or a national level kind of deployment, right? So which means that you're trading two things. So one, you have much more visibility into the entire contact network, including the time at which and the duration for which people interacted, their multi-hop network, so that you can do more proactive, sort of more aggressive contact tracing to the secondary and tertiary contacts as well. And furthermore, you can actually do proactive sort of analytics in terms of who are the most at-risk individuals based on their proximity and the duration of interactions, and sort of trying out various epidemiological models through this network to understand high-risk individuals. So that could potentially be used to reach out to them, or maybe do a higher level of testing and so on for such individuals as well, right? So you get much more information that you can put to use, but at the same time, to mitigate concerns about privacy, you want to keep this at the institutional level so that the data itself is the custodians of our data are your own institution. And even despite all of this, it's still anonymized data. So it's not like you're sharing personal information with your institution. So this is something that we try to sort of change the balance a little bit in terms of safety and privacy through this particular kind of a model. So this is the kind of a contact graph that we might build out of this type of contact trace data that's collected and sent to the back end. And what you see is the set of individuals as well as the time at which they were proximate with each other. And now in this scenario, let's say someone is tested COVID positive, like this N. What you can do is not just identify the neighbors who are primary contacts, but actually propagate this risk through the entire network based on a time-dependent sort of propagation, as well as the duration of contact, and potentially even the proximity of the contact, depending on the signal strength and so on. And what this allows you to do is better modulate your risk analysis on this network, so that if you might not be a primary contact, but if you're a secondary contact from multiple COVID positive subjects, potentially your risk might be higher than just a primary contact who was a brief interaction with a COVID positive subject. This kind of a cumulative modeling can potentially give much more visibility into the sort of risks through the system, rather than just doing primary contact tracing, right? The other thing that you can also do is in a proactive manner. For example, this A and D, these are two individuals who form the bridge between two clusters that you see at the top and the bottom, right? As a result of that, A and D are both more susceptible to catching the virus because they can interact, potentially catch, there are multiple pathways to them from both the clusters. And they also have a higher risk of propagating this virus if they get infected by COVID, right? So A and D, from just by looking at this graph, you can say that, hey, A and D are more high-risk individuals. So we have to do some more proactive measures, let's say like giving them incentives for doing social distancing, or sending them reminders for wearing masks, and potentially even doing proactive testing of them, right? That's the proactive measure that you can do, right? The other thing that's more obvious, simpler thing that we can do, and we are actually doing as part of the app, is sort of give you some metrics of your social distancing score in terms of how many new individuals you end up interacting with during a sort of a single day. And this also takes into account sort of the baseline in terms of the people that you're commonly around, let's say your family members or your hostel roommates and so on, so that you only sort of identify the additional risks that you're of new people that you get into contact with. And these are sort of social distancing scores that we send out to people in order to help them potentially adjust their routine and try to stay safer, right? And a bunch of other things that you could do as well over time once we have enough data and we understand how some of these models work over time. So these are a few pictures of the app itself and its installation. So all of this is part of a sort of research study at campus as well. There's an operational aspect. There's also a research aspect. So as a result of that, there's a lot of transparency in terms of the data that we collect through informed consent and so on. And there are also limitations on what we can put this data to use as part of this entire, both the operational aspect as well as the research aspect. And even the data that we collect is sort of as limited as possible. Your phone number is not required, for example. It's mostly required only for reinstalling the app more easily rather than necessarily as an intrinsic part of the sort of contact tracing itself. So that's strictly optional. Likewise, you don't have to sort of even something like GPS data is completely optional if you want to share it. The only thing that's sort of required is for you to share your GPS contact trace data. We also have sort of this is the main screen where you actually see as during the day, as the day progresses, how many of these scans were active, because unless you have your Bluetooth on and the scan is happening, the app is not really doing its role. So we actually have this power bar kind of thing. It's like those who use smartphones like Fitbit, this is like meeting your 10,000 steps during a day. So in our case, you want to meet that 1440 steps during scans during a day at 1 minute intervals. We also send out various types of reminders and alerts to users in terms of various social distancing or other sort of myths and realities about COVID. And I should acknowledge that we actually use some of the material from ISRC as part of these alerts that we send out to users, so that we want the users to be scientifically well informed and not sort of just follow potential rumors or myths and so on. We also have some basic sort of analytics and visualization in terms of how COVID status within Karnataka, within the country, and so on. And a couple of sort of unique things that we do is one, what you see in the top right, is a bit of a heat map of the neighborhood around you, in this case within campus, at some coarser granularity of 150 meters by 150 meters over the last 24 hours or so. And this can potentially help you with planning sort of your movement around the campus. So if you want to decide whether to go to the on-campus grocery store or not, you might sort of get a sense of how crowded it might be. And based on that, you might sort of decide whether to go or not, right? So this again tries to balance privacy versus information. And this is again, only for those who are sharing their GPS, which again is completely voluntary. So based on that, you can sort of share some of this information that can help with your daily planning. Another thing that we do is send users their 2-hop network neighborhood, which you see over here. And what this does is that it gives you a sense of how many people that are within your 2-hop neighborhood, right? You might think that, hey, I only ended up meeting 3 or 4 people in the entire day. But if the 3 or 4 people that you meet themselves are meeting some 10 people or so, effectively your risk is actually much higher than potentially even meeting 5 or 6 people, but all of them are themselves fairly not mingling and so on, practicing social distancing, right? So this sort of, again, sort of gives more visibility to users in terms of the potential sort of risks that they might have through their 2-hop neighborhood. Right? And again, all of this is anonymized data, so you only know that you are this purple circle, but everything around you are just anonymized dots. And the thickness of the edges give you the duration of interaction and so on. So now just based, we've actually had the app deployed on the campus for about 8 weeks now. So we had sort of the initial wave was when the first lockdown was lifted and students started coming back to campus. The initial wave of students started coming back to campus after they were all sent back home during the start of the lockdown. And you'll see that there's been a sort of sharp growth, and then we send out a few reminders asking people to, again, this is completely voluntary for use. It's not mandatory on campus, though There are opposing voices to that as well. And furthermore, besides the informed consent at the time they're installing the app, there's also an additional informed consent at the time we actually want to do contact tracing. So if someone is tested positive, before we can even use their contact data, even though we already have it, they have to again give a voluntary consent before we can initiate that, right? And on top of that, we also have an advisory board, which include faculty, students, staff, administrators, doctors, and also external bioethicists and so on, which has to approve use of this data for contact tracing. So in a sense, there are multiple checks and balances even within the institution before this data can actually put to use for contact tracing. Right? And we've also had multiple town hall meetings with students and faculty to answer their questions and put to rest some of their concerns. Right? The initial wave was more for students, and then we also had a sort of wave of release about a month back for faculty and staff. And we actually sent out a reminder a few days back. So each time you send a reminder, you see a nice jump in the number of registered users. And that itself is one of our sort of mini research studies to understand what motivates people to install the app and use the app, these reminders, and sort of how effective are these and so on. Or are people just getting sort of too tired of the entire COVID and sort of lose their sort of initiative? Another thing that we actually did a recent student survey just last week, just to understand why students use the app or don't use the app. A majority of them obviously use it to help with the health and safety of the campus. But then 53% of them also use it to help with COVID research beyond just the operational, their own sort of personal benefit. And about a third want to avoid a campus lockdown, right? So one way to think about it is that a large fraction are doing it for altruistic reasons, and there's one third are probably doing it out of fear of a campus lockdown, and about half and half are doing it again just for broader research benefits. And these are also multiple, like they could choose multiple options. That's why it doesn't add up to 100%. For those who are not using the app, a majority of them are either not on campus or they don't have, we still don't have an iOS version. It will be going out later this week. So some of these iPhone users will be supported, or some of them might be using a fairly old Android phone that's older than 4 years old or so, in which case the app doesn't support it because of some security protocols that are there in more recent Android versions. So for those who can actually install it but are not installing it, about 17% are concerned with privacy despite all these measures, which is fair, right? So it's, everyone has their right to an opinion. But also similar 17% feel that anyway, Arogya Setu is widely used, so that might be adequate, and yet another app might not be necessary, right? So this again gets a pulse of how students themselves feel about the entire app, and just gives you an insight into their thinking and their behavior. From some of the technical issues that I want to briefly highlight before I wrap up and move to Q&A. One is that, again, the digital contact tracing is not a sort of perfect solution by any means, right? Just like manual contact tracing has limitations, so does digital contact tracing. So it's both have to sort of complement each other. One of those key challenges is that the diversity in the different phone models means that not every phone is very reliable when it comes to Bluetooth scanning and advertising and picking up the other phones. These are broadly because of both human reasons, because people might sort of switch off their Bluetooth or forget to turn it back on and so on, in which case the phone cannot scan or advertise. And it's also because some of these phone brands are very aggressive when it comes to keeping apps running in the background, right? They actually kill the app to optimize the battery. And because of that, sort of the app might not be running in the background. And there are also other kinds of idiosyncrasies depending on the phone brand and model, right? So there are sort of a fair bit of challenges. Again, you don't read about it enough in the public media, but that's the reality when it comes to pretty much any of these apps out there, right? So installing it is one, but actually collecting reliable data is a bigger challenge as well. There are also challenges with respect to asymmetry between two models, especially when it comes to the signal strength that is detected. And the signal strength can be a good proxy for the proximity between individuals, right? Again, because two people who are 20 feet apart but can still pick up each other's devices are not necessarily at risk. But this again, there's a lot of asymmetry between phone models, as well as attenuation due to your environmental conditions, right? So you have to sort of, we are still working on various models by which we can get a more reliable mapping between the signal strength that you detect with the potential distance at which the individuals might be. And here this table here tells you how some of this asymmetry works. Some models, these are various models. We have a nice test bed sitting in our like home lab in a sense, with about a dozen different phone models and a dozen tablets and so on. And what we see over here is that not every phone is able to advertise and pick up the other phones in a reliable manner, right? So in a perfect world, all these would be at around 9,000 in both these matrices. But some cases, especially with between iPhone and Android, there's a lot of, even an iPhone and iPhone, there's a lot of unreliability that happens. And also between different phone models that are present, right? And these are things that we try to proactively help out students by having help desks and so on that can help them change their settings in the background to ensure that the data collection is more reliable. But that's it's still something that we are actively working on to ensure reliable data collection. So this, I just want to show you this one graph, which is a sort of subset of the contact graph that we have during a 24-hour period. So during the, obviously midnight to midnight, initially there's no interaction. As time goes along, people start interacting with each other. And the size of each of these vertices again refer to how many other new people that they are interacting with. So the larger the circle, it means that more people they end up interacting with. And I'm sure one of these clusters over here, probably the one on top, is probably the test bed that we have, but most of the others are actually real users. And this gives you a sense, and this is sort of the larger version of the graph is really where some of the analytics and so on work, right? And at the end of the day, as far as we are concerned, we only know these as random device IDs. We actually don't know who these individuals are. And for doing actual contact tracing, which goes through, like I said, the consent from the user, consent from the advisory board, and so on, to de-anonymize the data for the contact network, that actually has to be initiated by the health center and go through approvals. And even then, the data itself is de-anonymized only by the health center themselves. And we in the backend have no idea who these individuals are. Right? And that's sort of some of the safety measures that we have in place. So there are other challenges besides sort of that we have to deal with. So one is sort of getting people to use it and keep using it. There are also challenges with respect to people who might be not just completely residential within campus, or people who might be stepping out of campus, or people who are from outside campus who visit campus, or faculty and staff who are not residential on campus but come to work and so on. So that's something that this app by itself cannot fully solve. That's where the role of other apps like Araghetu are critical as well. You also have issues with people potentially transmitting the virus through surfaces, not through physical proximity in time at the same time with each other. This could be, for example, tables in the mess where two people are sitting and accidentally has not been cleaned, and potentially people sitting at the same desk at different times could contract it through the surface for the few hours or so that the virus can survive over there. Like I said before, GPS collection is not mandatory; it's completely optional. Which means that in such cases, we are not, unless they have GPS shared, we are not able to capture this kind of transmission through physical surfaces. One potential solution that we have is through using these Bluetooth beacons that could be placed at sort of high use locations like messes or ATMs and so on, so that even if they are spatially temporarily disconnected, the fact that they were at a physical location could be picked up by the fact that both see these beacons. And lastly, though we have all this data being collected from the contact network, the effectiveness of some of these scores and epidemiological models is not guaranteed unless we have some ground truth data. And again, the challenge about ground truth data is that it means that you are going to have sort of COVID cases on campus. And that is not something that you really wish for. But until you actually validate it with sort of the real cases on campus and how far they are spreading and so on, as coupled with sort of wider testing of not just COVID positive subject or primary contacts, but also the wider population, it's hard to sort of scientifically show which of these models work and which of these don't, right? But again, these are all open questions, but this is something that we hope to get throw a bit more light on over the subsequent few months or so. With that, I'll stop. And again, besides the entire GoCoronaGo team, we also have people at IISc, both advisory, both health centers and so on, who have helped us, as well as Crossbow Labs, who have helped with pro bono on some of the security testing of the app and the backend, as well as the Department of Science and Technology, which is partly funding this project through their Rakshak program. Thank you, and I'm happy to take questions.
Hey, thanks, Yogesh. That was a great talk and quite clear on the aspects of GoCoronaGo as well as your experience at IISc. So we have a whole bunch of questions, actually, starting from questions which were sent by the speakers and some by the registrants, as well as some questions which are coming on the chat as we speak. So let me start with. So there is a bunch of questions. So I'll try to bunch them together and ask them to you so that similar questions you can take. Let's start with one on the effectiveness of the GoCoronaGo app itself, which is that it's kind of an obvious question, which is that given that it's a voluntary app, it is only as effective as how many people choose to opt in for it. So in that case, what challenges, how effective is it? What can you say about it? And secondly, about if there are people coming into the campus at one-off kind of instances, this would not cover that, right? So in terms of effectiveness, what do you have to say about this app?
Sure. So we still don't have an answer on the effectiveness question, right? So right now, we've had several cases on campus, and unfortunately, it's been for people who didn't have the app installed on them, right? And since it's completely voluntary and sort of we are consciously making it that way, it does depend a lot on how comfortable people are in installing the app and in collecting the data, right? So a few things that we are doing to proactively reach out to people, having these town hall meetings, sending out these regular reminders. As you saw, we see a nice jump of a few hundred more people installing it each time a reminder goes through. But then there's also the saturation effect. If they get too many reminders, so people might get a little bit irritated as well. So it's a fine balance that we are trying to draw in terms of both educating people who might have concerns on installing the app, and these concerns might range from privacy all the way to, hey, how much is my battery going to be sort of draining? And some might also be skeptical, saying that, hey, if it's not, if you haven't found any contacts to the app, then it's not working at all, right? So it's a bit of a chicken and egg problem for people to believe that it will work, and it's worth sacrificing a little bit of their privacy, right? So the question is still out on whether we will be able to show this as an effective solution with a voluntary model of usage, right? The second question, in terms of external people who are visiting campus, that's where the use of more city or national level apps like ISRC to come into play. And that will help you actually connect some of these networks together, right? And these will be independent pockets of data. So, for example, if there's a higher density of users using the GoCoronaGo app within the campus, right, then there's a higher chance that maybe even if someone from outside comes into campus and they're using, let's say, the Arogya Setu app, and a smaller fraction of people within campus are using the Arogya Setu app, but still the fact is that you can couple the primary contacts of the person having Arogya Setu off campus, right, with potentially some of the Arogya Setu apps within campus, but then tie that in with the data collected through GoCoronaGo, right, so that you actually couple these two networks together, but at the same time, not pooling all the data together, right? So the data from IISc still remains within IISc, data from RxC still remains with the government. But as part of the contact tracing, you can like look at the boundary between the two and try to sort of tie those information together, right? So, and we feel this kind of a federated model is sort of the right approach for a large country with a great deal of diversity for us, as well as sort of protecting some of these civil rights, is to ensure that you have sort of captive communities would run their own equivalent of contact tracing apps, and they have ownership of the data, they have control of the data, but only selectively share anonymized data at the time of a contact and only for the sake of contact tracing, and couple this with use apps like RxC or tying up the data.
Yeah, so kind of a follow-up question. So one of the things that you mentioned was about the privacy issue. So of course, there's a huge amount of, I mean, even in our questions, I think half of them are on the privacy issue. So the first question is, could you explain a little bit more how you anonymize the data that you collect?
Sure.
Secondly, so you mentioned a little bit about what you mentioned is a federated model in terms of how this. So this, I believe, would be if you want to scale the model from IISc to maybe a whole of even Bangalore, forget or even whole of just that area, right, in Bangalore. So it would be you would require to address a whole bunch of different challenges in terms of, especially in terms of privacy and anonymity. So what do you do, and what would you envisage for this next step? And could you also, if possible, contrast that with what Arogya Setu and the other big apps which are being used, they do that, right?
Yeah, so the aspects of privacy are sort of central to the app design right from day one, right? So the first thing that we do is collect as minimal information that's possible, and any incremental information that would be useful but not as critical is completely left voluntary to the user, right? So sharing phone number is not mandatory. Sharing GPS is not mandatory, right? The only thing that people are users are mandatorily sharing with us are a random device ID that's assigned to the app at the time that you install it, right? And that is and the contacts themselves are just other random device IDs, right? The mapping between the random device ID and the actual individual actually goes through two levels of anonymization, right? So we have something called an invitation code that we give out to people for them to install the app, right? Once they as a part of the installation. So within the GoCoronaGo team, we have a mapping from that invitation ID to the random device ID that's generated, right? And separately, another sandbox within IISc, whom we don't talk with, they actually have a mapping between this invitation code and the actual individual to whom this invitation was given to, right? So the time of contact tracing, the health center essentially says that, hey, this particular device ID, right, was tested COVID positive. We don't know who, the app side don't know who that is, right? But we are just given this device ID, right? And at that time, we actually send a OTP to that, for that particular app for that device ID saying that, hey, looks like you were tested positive. Are you willing to share your contact data for contact tracing with the health center, right? And if they give consent, right, then it goes to the advisory board, which has students, faculty, ethicists, and so on. And they look at the case and they say that, okay, this looks as a genuine case. The individual has given consent. The health center has recommended it. At that point in time, what we do is that we identify all the other device IDs, the primary and the secondary contacts and so on. And we give a list of these device IDs to the health center, right? The health center, with the approval of the advisory board and so on, go to this other third party, which is managing the mapping from the invitation code to the individual. And then they ask them, hey, here is a set of device IDs, right? Now for these, give us who those individuals are. And the invitation code is the link between the two. So even the person who's de-anonymizing it doesn't even know who's the original positive case, right? They just know that, hey, here are a pool of IDs. Some of them, one of them is positive, many of them are primary, many of them are secondary. So this way, only the health center at the end of the day gets to know who is the original patient, the primary contacts, and the secondary contacts, right? And even the phone number that they can optionally share, which is primarily for installation, it's kept in an encrypted form, and it can only be decrypted in case there's an emergency and you're not able to, let's say, reach out to that particular individual who's a primary contact through email, which is how we send the invitation codes. Then the advisory board can ask us to decrypt that data and share it with the health center. So these are some of the steps, checks and balances that are in place, so that unless it's the entire campus conspiring together to decrypt the data, it's very hard to de-anonymize the data, right? When it comes to federation, the model that we are envisaging in order to scale out down the line, once we are able to show that it's working within IISc, that's really step one, is to potentially have some of these campuses or IT parks and so on, who are physically might have people interfacing with each other. They might individually install the app and maintain the data, but when it comes to contact tracing, they might share this anonymized subset of the network with a neutral body, potentially like IISc, which would essentially help you with contact tracing across this federated system, right? So you don't share the entire data, you only share data that's the boundary of these two networks. And then you share it back with the institution saying that, hey, here are potentially the ones who are primary or secondary. And then you can go through your regular de-anonymization process that I just described in order to do that, right? So it's a little bit more, it has a few more steps than, let's say, something like Arogya Setu, where all the data is central. But all of these steps could be completely automated in the sense that you'd still have humans and loops doing the checks and balances. But in terms of time taken for enacting this might not be any much more. It might go from a few seconds to a few minutes or maybe a few hours. But that's pretty much all it would take to do your primary and secondary contact tracing. When it comes to apps like Arogya Setu, right? Some of them, again, they run the entire gamut, right? So there are extreme cases, and these are sort of things that even Google and Apple are proposing, where data is strictly local, strictly anonymized within the smartphone itself. And when you want to do contact tracing, only very minimal data is sent to the backend, right? And that can be very, very targeted, but it sort of doesn't give you the benefits of secondary and tertiary contact tracing, and it doesn't allow you to do anything proactive in order to mitigate the virus in the first place. And there are sort of to the other end of the spectrum are sort of apps which collect your phone number mandatorily, which collect your GPS information mandatorily, and potentially other personal information mandatorily as well. And these again, it depends on the how comfortable you are sharing your GPS and your phone number and your contact trace data from your Bluetooth, as well as filling out various survey forms and so on, to a central party who has access to all this information, right? The other challenge also, especially in a country like India, is that our privacy laws are fairly weak. Meaning there are sort of conversations of having stronger privacy laws, but in the absence of that, it's hard to even take recourse to law in case people don't do what they say they're doing in their terms and conditions, right? So in our case, it's dual level of check, both from a human ethics perspective. We have our consent form and the human ethics committee that we have to report to, as well as the legal terms and conditions that we have to report to, besides the advisory board and so on.
Great. So, so basically, what you're saying is really that you have a trusted authority, so the centralization, but at a local level, and that, in some sense, is the trust that you build in. So, for instance, even if you had to do field contact tracing, you would still need a trusted authority, which is the health center, which would allow it. So, this is, you would like to, in some sense, say that is the level at which you want centralization, not at the like a pan-India level, which is perhaps what Arogya Setu would be doing. So,
furthermore, just to maybe just add a nuance to that, it's even within IISc, it's not centralized, right? There's no one individual in IISc or even a small. It requires actually 3 groups of people to come together, right? Well, 4 groups of people. The health center has to come together. The sort of independent mapping maintained between the invitation code and the contacts, that they have to come together. The GCG team has to come together, and the advisory board have to come together. And these are about 20 people, which spans students, faculty, staff, doctors, external third-party members, and so on. Unless all of us collude together, there is no centralized view of the data.
Right. So, in fact, another set of questions that I have received are about what you pointed out, that how can you prevent misuse of the data, especially by security agencies or by, in some sense, I guess the question can also be broadened to saying that if somebody is using the data not for the stated purpose, right, is there a built-in safety measure, or what is it, not only for your app, but what would you say is the right way to do things?
Right. So that's a lot of that is unfortunately just based on trust right now, right? So so you have to trust that people who are custodians of your data will actually do what they are saying they will do, and nothing more than that, right? The second is sort of the legal recourse, which again, like I said, is more limited. Yet another one is to sort of more transparency, right? So in terms of how things work and what are sort of the practices that you follow, be it sort of making the source code open source is just one thing, but a lot of the data is in the backend. It's not there in your phone itself or in the source code of the phone itself. And limiting what you collect, right? The lesser that you can collect and the more you can do with what you collect, the better off you are. And having clear sort of sunset clauses saying that your data will not be used for more than so and so, so and so. And by the way, here are independent ombudsmen or independent third parties who can verify the fact that you are sort of both retaining the data only for that period, and you're also only putting the data to use as much as you want to use, right? As much as you're supposed to use. That's where you need oversight. You need transparent oversight, right? It can't be sort of like a black box in terms of where the data goes, how it's used, and so on. And it should be sort of written down in black and white, and it should be verified. because you can't even take recourse to the law until you know that it's being misused, and you won't even know it's being misused unless you know how it's being used, right? So there are a lot of sort of these black box issues that come into play, which is why, in a sense, if you take Google and Apple, they have this exposure notification API that they've sort of launched as part of their OS itself. They take an extreme view in the sense that they don't trust the user, like the developers who are using this APIs, right? They limit it to only one app per country, and typically there's going to be a government app, and they are very clear that you cannot collect GPS, for example. You cannot connect phone number information, right, as part of for any app that's using this notification, right? Because they essentially want to ensure that only the contact data is collected, nothing more than that, right? Anything else that you want to do, you'll have to do it independently, right? So those are where technology itself prevents you from sort of misusing the data. But then side effect of that is that the use that you can put to you is much more narrower, right?
Right. Just one second. Right. So I actually a slightly orthogonal question. There's a question on Facebook which asks you which library did you use for graph animation? Yeah.
I think the one that I showed was Gephi, but for some of our online dashboarding, we use Plotly, and there are also Wiz.js is another library, online library I've seen that's being used for some of the Singapore data visualization on the portal. And there's also NetworkX and a few others, right? So, but the one that you saw on the screen was actually Gephi, G-E-P-H-I, that we use for online visualization of temporal graphs.
Okay, thanks. So coming back to the other kind of issues that we were discussing. One other requirement, I mean, for apps is about whether your the GoCoronaGo is open source, and how does it compare to Arogya Setu? Is that open source? And what about other countries? Their apps, the best ones, are they open source? What is your thing?
Right. So at this point in time, the GoCoronaGo app is not open source because we are still working on sort of improving some of the features. And but the expectation is that at the end of the day, eventually it's going to be made open source, and especially when you're looking at a larger scale rollout. But we do have sort of people within IISc who are sort of looking at the app source code, not beyond just the GCG team. And this has also gone through a security review by Crossbow Labs, which is a certified agency that have looked at the apps and the backend as well in terms of what it does. But the expectation is that it will eventually be made open source. The other issue is also that the iOS app is still something that we are working on, and sort of we want to make sure that some of the protocols themselves might fundamentally change based on how the compatibility between Android and iOS work. So it's still a work in progress, and sort of once it stabilizes, the hope will be that this might be the platform for many others to develop their own flavors of the app as well down the line. So there are several nationwide apps that have been made open source, including Arogya Setu. The Android version of that is open source. The iOS is still not open source. The in Singapore's Trace Together, they actually make us the Blue Trace protocol, which is open sourse. NHS in UK, they had a sort of failed attempt at a nationwide contact tracing app called I'm blanking out on the name, but they had a sort of attempt at that didn't quite sort of go through fully. So they actually had a sort of trial at Wales, but then they sort of discontinued that. But the source code is out online. But they take a slightly different approach where they actually make a Bluetooth connection between devices rather than just scanning for that. But that sort of has its own pros and cons, but they haven't deployed that. And some of the apps, I think in Canada more recently, and potentially maybe even the Australian one, they're actually using Google and Apple's exposure notification API, right? And there again, I think both Apple and Google, they put out sort of sample codes which you can build on top of for using their exposure notification API. But there again, its role is very, very limited in terms of what it can do. So broadly speaking, I would definitely say that making these app source codes open source, as well as having some transparency in terms of what goes on the backend. It's not just the app, but most of the data that's collected and analyzed in the backend. So having clear policies in terms of how your data will be used and what it cannot be used for, right? So it's because it's sort of like a quadrant of what's the pros and cons, right? So are the pros sort of good enough to outweigh the cons, right? And this is how complete transparency both on the app side and as well as the backend. making that decision is going to be difficult for individuals.
Right. And a related question is, of course, the right to be forgotten. So at what point do you forget this information? So what about GoCoronaGo? Do you have these things built in? Do you say 6 months, once this is gone, we will delete everything? What is the policy that...
Right. So for GoCoronaGo, any personal information that's collected, and at this point, the only personal information that's collected, it's really the phone number information, right? That will be deleted 30 days after you uninstall the app, right? So the completely anonymous information, which is pretty much your contact tracing data, that will be kept on for a bit longer, and typically it's going to be because that has research uses beyond the operational use. That's why we actually go through the informed consent as part of the app installation, because it's part of a research study as well as the operational part. In the operational part, it's going to be sort of forgotten once this COVID situation stabilizes. But the research part, which is the strictly anonymized data, that might be used on for a bit longer, but completely governed by the Human Ethics Committee rules of IISc.
Right. So there's one question which has just come up about, so suppose someone wants to host this for their institute. Suppose I'm at IIT Bombay and I want to say that I want to bring it at IIT Bombay. Then is there a closed source dependency, or is it completely independent? Do the institution servers have to communicate among each other? What's your...
Right. So here again, there are two models. One, you can completely have it as an island, like we're doing in IISc. You can completely replicate this at another institution. And this actually makes sense if the institutions are not physically proximate to each other. They are in different cities and so on, right? But for institutions that might be physically close to each other, right? Like the IISc campus, and we're also sort of talking to NCBS, which is a few kilometers away, and we also have faculty going between the two locations. So there it might actually make sense to have the independent deployments, but with this federation model, right? So that it's possible for you to share limited data between these two institutions. But otherwise, an app like GoCoronaGo is designed strictly for the institution. It should not be a city-wide one. At most, it should be for clusters of institutions within the city. Yeah.
Right. One other question which has come in is about, did you do some manual contact tracing to supplement the data collected by app? You had mentioned about some other data that how do you do this supplementing and how did it work out? And a related question is, how successful was the app in detecting COVID cases? I mean, and how did you measure its success?
Right. So that's one of the challenges that I mentioned, right? So far, we've had several cases at IISc, but these were cases for example, hostel staff who hadn't installed the app, or some of the students who had not installed the app. So far, we don't have a case where the user was the primary sort of infected person was a GoCoronaGo app user. And given the way in which the data is structured, it's strictly one way. So we share the data with the health center. They don't share any data with us. Right? So that's the design of it, right? And that's also sort of from a scientific validation perspective, that becomes a challenge as well, right? So down the line, we might come up with additional maybe research studies, which has to again go through Human Ethics Committee approval and so on, and additional informed consent that potentially, with users' consent, manual contact tracing data can be anonymized. Manual contact tracing data could be tied in with the digital contact tracing data to see how effective it was. But that is a whiles away, right, from an ethics perspective.
Right. So there was one more question. Sorry, I just missed this. Right. So a slightly more kind of a high-level question is, you had mentioned about the use of GPS, for instance, and Google, for instance, uses only a location tracing app, right? So it's not versus a GPS-based app versus a Bluetooth-based app, which is GoCoronaGo or the other apps. So what are really the difference between these two, and are there advantages, disadvantages? How do you trade them off?
Right. So I think the three major techniques that are out there is a GPS-based one, the other is Bluetooth-based one, which is by far the popular one. And there are also sort of recent works on an app called Novid, which actually uses ultrasound for sort of doing these sort of contact tracing. The GPS one, the challenge is that it is fairly coarse in terms of the accuracy. So it might end up having a lot of false positives. And there's also challenges with GPS being sort of attenuated within buildings and sort of even within tree cover and so on, occasionally. So as a result of that, though it's much more pervasive, it is you can collect it often, but the accuracy is pretty bad in terms of the spatial accuracy. Right? Bluetooth contact tracing is by far the most popular because it also gives you a good estimate of the proximity between. Well, it's a better estimate of proximity between individuals compared to GPS data. Right? But on the flip side, GPS also gives you the location so that even if you are in two people are in the same location at different points in time, you could still get some of the benefits of sort of, let's say, surface-based transfer. So these are sort of the broad differences. This app that uses ultrasound, they seem to claim sort of almost like an order of centimeter accuracy in terms of the proximity. But personally, for me, the key concern is that they need your microphone to be on all the time. Right? So whether people are comfortable with that in the age of Alexa and all those things, maybe people are comfortable with it. But I feel a little bit queasy about keeping a microphone on all the time in order to get a highly accurate contact tracing.
Right. So another kind of a broad level question. So I think you've already answered some part of it, but it's coming up again and again. It's about the decentralized apps versus the centralized apps, right? And there is also these, for instance, the protocol, this D3PT, the distributed protocols, and so on. So the question is there a theoretical way to establish that there is an authority on the data, and how do you compare decentralized versus centralized? Which one does Arogya Setu use? And can you clearly say what is, in this aspect, the difference between your app and other apps?
Sure. So with Arogya Setu, this is what's, I can only comment on what is sort of disclosed by the government in public fora. And from what it's said, the data is supposed to reside in your phone, the Bluetooth data at least. And as part of the contact tracing, they get access to that, right? But again, that's sort of we just have to take the government at their word and leave it at that. So in that sense, you'd classify that as a decentralized approach, right? And many of these, sort of, for example, even the Singapore Stage Together and many of the other government apps around the world are designed to be decentralized. But these are national scale data collection, right? That's sort of the key distinction over here. So how much it's sort of, even in your private life, right, or even your daily life, right, the amount of information that your the organization you work for or the organization that you study at knows is potentially way more than what the government might know, right? And this is a sort of trade-off that we do on a daily basis, right? And that's really the idea that we are sort of like putting together in GoCoronaGo. GoCoronaGo and Arogya Setu have slightly different goals, right? So Arogya Setu has to scale to a national level, and it has to sort of help with contact tracing of the public at large, right? For us, the goal is much more narrower, but the custodians of data is also very well defined, and it can be very easily verified in terms of where the data is, how it's being used, and so on. And there's a lot of transparency. The transparency, as well as the custodians of data, is what adds to the trust, right? So that's why plus the fact that it's strictly voluntary, even within an institutional setting, right, it is voluntary, right? Though, like I said, there are sort of people who want it to be made mandatory, especially if you're not able to do effective contact tracing, right? So then the question is, make it mandatory, right? That's the immediate knee-jerk reaction. So that's sort of the trade-off that we are making consciously, right? Saying that, hey, if you have more adoption within the institution because of better trust, and because of that, if you're able to do more proactive as well as more effective reactive primary, secondary, and tertiary contact tracing, and you're collecting only minimal data, which is just the contact trace, the Bluetooth data, and everything else is completely optional, and it's strictly voluntary. So you have all these things in place, and that we feel gives the right sort of balance for people to decide for themselves if that is good for them or not, right? I know people who won't install any app, whether it's Arogya Setu or GoCoronaGo. There are people who sort of, like I said, 17% of them feel that Arogya Setu is good enough, I don't want yet another app. And there are many others who actually use only GoCoronaGo and not Arogya Setu, right? So you have different spectrums. So we just feel this is just another option for people to think about.
Right. So a related question is, if you were looking at this hyper-localized setup like IISc or just one institute, why not why not use a separate device, a bracelet or a smart card or something, rather than tying up with a mobile, which immediately brings in all these issues which could just be subverted if you use a harder app, which is different. So did you think about this?
Oh yeah, we did, especially when we were initially doing things. One of the biggest sort of feedback that we got in the initial month that we were developing the app was, hey, not everyone in India has a smartphone, right? That was more the sort of rationale for that. In fact, we spent some time thinking about whether you could do this on feature phones. In fact, some of the idea that Novod is using in terms of the ultrasound, we actually even sort of played around with that idea initially in the first month of maybe in the back in March, April. They're playing around with that idea, right? And back then, when we were originally developing the app initially, we were in a complete lockdown, right? Literally a global lockdown. So we couldn't even get hold of phones other than what we had lying around in our houses for testing it, right? So the dozen or so phones that you see was after the lockdown was lifted. The first thing we did was rush to sort of store and buy 5 or 6 of these diverse devices. There's also the issue of cost and accessibility, right? So the bracelets are the ones that will only be, let's say, a Bluetooth beacon, but it won't be able to scan it. It will be able to advertise it, but not scan it, which means you still need some other device for doing scanning, right? So there have been solutions, for example, which might have a phone with GoCoronaGo sitting in a room, right? But people all around the building or the campus have bracelets on them, right? So if you go into a physical space, then you will know that that particular individual was in that physical space, right? But once you're out there, or even if 2 individuals come near each other, you won't be able to detect the fact that they came near each other, right? So you could have customized solutions, but for a narrower set of things. Like, for example, when you want to do sort of geofencing, a bracelet-based approach is great, right? That coupled with a smartphone and GPS and so on, you could do that. But just purely, maybe there's a technology opportunity over here for people in the hardware space. If you could do something like a bracelet that just strictly does only scanning and advertising, and when you occasionally it might sync with your smartphone, like your Fitbit, right? Your smartwatch, it'll upload this to the cloud and so on. That might be an alternative, but at the end of the day, somehow data has to go from your person to somewhere in the back end. And the smartphone is the most obvious computing device and a network connected device that can do that.
Right. So there's one technical question. So you had mentioned about identifying high-risk people in your graphs, right? Did you have a supervised data set? And otherwise, what graph heuristics did you use to identify these ones?
Right. So a lot of our the graph models that we use are based on some of these epidemiological models, and some of these are also based on sort of classic centrality algorithms on top of graph data. So like between a centrality, a neighborhood centrality, and so on. And a lot of these have been studied in existing literature, but they've been studied mostly theoretically, right? And it's not just in sort of epidemiology, but even social networks, right? So if you want an advertisement or a meme to be propagated, right? The idea is fairly simple, right? A meme is just another virus, right? That's propagating. So we use some of these classic models, but I think the real value for us, and again, this will happen down the lane as we get more data, especially on sort of COVID positive subjects and so on, and effective contact tracing. We'll know which of these models actually work in practice, right? So right now we have maybe half a dozen of these scores and models available, which we actually don't disclose to the user other than the social distancing, because we're very clearly told by a ethics committee, right? Do no harm, right? Which means that don't sort of put out data that you're not confident about, that you have scientifically tested. So the social distancing score is sort of the most obvious, simple thing to interpret. It is just the number of unique users that you've come across, right? That people understand there's no sort of risk in that, and you can share that. But anything beyond that in terms of the risk scores and so on, which are, again, like I said, some of the centrality scores, we don't actually share it with the users yet, though we know what those measures are for these randomized users. Yeah.
Great. So I think we are kind of running out of time. So maybe I'll still questions coming in. So let me ask one more question, and maybe we'll wind up with that. So, so I think there's this question on when do you expect your app to finish its testing phase? Are you planning to do more? And when would you expect to make it open source as well? And if there is a reason to delay these things, what is the reason? And yeah, what is the future of this?
Right. So in terms of when the app will be available for wider availability, so I think as scientists, our first role is to ensure that the app really works, right? Given all the data that we're collecting within the institutional setting. And we still, and that will happen only if we have enough adoption within IISc sufficient to do effective contact tracing, right? So once I think we've been able to show that it actually works in practice in the field for doing contact tracing, at that point in time, we'll be more comfortable about making this available outside outside IISc. And even there, we'll probably partner with a few institutions initially to do a sort of slightly wider thing. And eventually, it'll be maybe made available broader than that as well. Right? So again, thankfully, we are academics. We are in the scientific business, not in the commercial or the startup business, which means we can afford to do things right rather than necessarily doing things fast. Right? In terms of making it open source, I think once we are making it available outside IISc, that's at some point in time that we would be comfortable, and by the time things would have stabilized in terms of source code and so on, that would be something that we'd be happy to share out there as well. A third minor point is that also some of these operational issues in terms of do they have the servers to host it and all those things, who does the maintenance, and because right now we have a small army of students who sort of keep monitoring some of these things, making sure the services are up and running and they're kept secure and all those things. So those are some of the operational issues that will have to be sorted out as well. And there are also sort of almost legal issues in terms of liabilities for IISc. So the legal team will get into play. Even if you're making it available for free, down the line, how do you ensure that if something goes wrong, even within that institution which is hosting it, how do you ensure that all the sort of IISc itself is indemnified from that and so on? So there are a bunch of these issues that come into play when you want to scale out. But the first key step is to make sure that it works effectively.
Right. All right. So I think that's a good time to stop the talk now. But indeed, if there are more questions, please ask, and I think we will forward them to say Yogesh and his team. I hope I didn't miss any questions. If so, please let me know. But I think we've already overshot by 7 minutes, so maybe it's a good time to stop. Thanks.
Thank you.
Just a quick note, next week, please join us, all of you, on a new topic, on a topic of why coronavirus doesn't cause disease in bats. We know that bats are carriers of coronavirus, but they somehow strangely are not affected by them. So why is this? And the two experts who will be talking about it are Angelique Korthals from City University, New York, and Liliana Davalos from Stony Brook. Thanks a lot, Yogesh. Thanks everyone for attending, and we'll see you next week. Thanks. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks, Yogesh.